We are talking about the theocracy that is inflexible, dogmatic, repressive, authoritarian, but this is not black and white. And then it brings me to the question of, is it only about the reality of democracy versus authoritarianism?
From Amman, I am Francesca Maria Lorenzini, and this is Near East, the podcast that brings the East a little bit closer. Today we have here Kourosh Ziabari, an Iranian journalist based in the US, who has written for outlets such as Nuanced magazine, Foreign Policy, and Politico about Middle Eastern affairs with a focus on Iran. He began his career in Tehran, where he worked for major publications in the country. Hi Kourosh, thank you so much for joining us today.
Hi Francesca, thanks very much for this conversation, and I'm delighted to join you.
When we look at what's happening in Iran right now, how are these waves of unrest different from earlier waves of protests in Iran?
Sadly, as far as we understand, there's a consensus that the crackdown has been violent, brutal, and also the amount of destruction of public property, vandalism that has taken place, arson attacks, all of that have happened on an unprecedented scale, which means that this round of protests were different, not just from the perspective of the extent and magnitude of the state-sanctioned violence that was imposed on the protesters, but also from the perspective of the actions of those who were either participating in the protests or actually pretended to be part of the protesters. We know that there have been external actors who were agitating, pretty much encouraging increased activity, either violence or simply disobedience. What we know is that the protest started on December 28th as an organic, authentic movement for change, when people were just fed up and saturated with the burden of the economic challenges and hardships. Overnight devaluation of the national currency, plummeting of rial, which currently is one of the, or technically the most worthless currency in the world. Still, people found a way to express their unhappiness and their grievances. They took to the streets. They staged a nationwide uprising that was pretty much peaceful. And that was something that was rattling the establishment, because when you have a legitimate demand and when you take it to the streets, any act of retaliation by the government would be considered as self-deprecating and pretty much short-sighted, an indication of the insecurities of the government. When things kind of turn violent, so that's something that we have to try to understand why it happened, where this entire idea of largest scale destruction of public property originated from. Why do we have ambulances, buses being incinerated, and why do we have people being pitted against each other? All in all, I know that we are talking about a divided country, a country that is psychologically tormented, a country that is afflicted with collective trauma, a country that is pretty much a failed state. So when the central government is incapable of running the affairs in a prudent and realistic way, all it can do is to suppress journalists, academics, dissidents, and scholars, the most peaceful people on earth, and fill its prisons with critical thinkers. And when at the same time you have a country unable to defend itself in the face of foreign aggression, when the war in June broke out after Israel's unprovoked attacks on the country, 1,062 Iranians were killed during 12 days of war. So this is a country that is showing to the world that is vulnerable and susceptible to whatever form of infiltration and manipulation that you can imagine.
You mentioned the war against Israel last summer, the so-called 12 Days War. How did it affect Iran on an international level?
I mean, first, if we are to diagnose the root causes of the war, there's this long-standing, again, self-deprecating policy of the Islamic Republic of Iran in ramping up anti-Israeli rhetoric, policymaking, and provocation and agitation. But during the war, I mean, what happened was that Iran was in the middle of a non-proliferation negotiation with the White House. Iran and the United States were actively talking about the future of Iran's nuclear program, and at that time, there was no indication, according to U.S. intelligence community and the International Atomic Energy Agency, that Iran was racing toward a nuclear weapon. So things could actually proceed, and at some point, either the talks would result in a negotiated outcome, in a deal between Trump and Tehran, or it would just simply collapse. And at that point, the international community could weigh its options. But in the middle of the talks, Israel actually unraveled diplomacy by launching surprise, unprovoked attacks on Iran, also pretty much leaving its foremost partner and ally, the United States, in limbo. So Trump had to justify the attacks by saying that he knew from the beginning. I mean, we're not sure. Maybe he did. But he was also actively sending his Middle East envoy, Steve Witkoff, to Oman and also to Italy in Rome to negotiate with his Iranian counterpart. So this was going on. And during the war, Iran, in not my perspective, but in the view of so many military analysts and defense analysts, was militarily humiliated and realized that it was incapable of defending the territorial integrity and sovereignty of its borders. Then the world realized that Iran was on the leaders who were pretty much openly talking about their ideal vision for the collapse of the government in Tehran, and also something that many Iranians would love to see, but not through the fighter jets and bombs, missiles of a foreign government, but through their own organic and homegrown action. You had opinion writers openly talking about the disintegration of Iran into smaller pieces of land, territories, ethnic regions. So all of a sudden, everyone was quite excited that not just the Islamic Republic of Iran, but Iran as this apparently major regional power and this long-standing sovereign nation may possibly just break apart. And of course, Iran, because it's been embracing so much misguided policies, hasn't had any meaningful alliances. So it had to again rely on its own capabilities to an extent, deter the foreign aggression and also secure its citizenry. And then the Iranian people who are feeling that not only their own government failed them, but the international community also just abandoned them and left them alone.
When you follow Western media coverage of Iran, how does it strike you? What parts of the stories are being misunderstood or oversimplified?
I have to make this disclaimer that the coverage of foreign policy issues, the coverage of the world, oftentimes happens to be quite reductionist and ingrained in stereotypes and cliches. There are specific terminologies and words and phrases that are reserved for certain geographies, and each country is understood in terms of those old tropes and stereotypes and cliches. So, I mean, whenever you hear the name of a specific region of the world, there are mental cognitive associations that come with those names. That's because over time, for not years, but decades, we have been hearing those descriptions frequently, and that's how our mentality has been shaped. So with Iran, what strikes me is just the fact that sometimes I feel when reading major legacy newspapers and publications, it strikes me as if I'm reading the press releases of governments in European capitals or the United States government when it's run by hardline Republican politicians. First, the fact that there's a huge resistance to the coverage of everything that is not exclusively pertaining to Iran's nuclear dilemma or Iran's proxy activities, its support for militant groups in the Middle East, or its malign behavior, or the fact that whatever Iran does has to be described in terms of a cranky child that is behaving badly and needs to be disciplined. This huge resistance and opposition to the coverage of Iranian arts and culture that I've personally witnessed is something that I'm still trying to come to terms with. If there's this much conversation about support for Iranian people and that everyone stands with the Iranian people, there needs to be a concrete and tangible way of substantiating that support. One way of doing that is to highlight what the Iranian people, this human collective, does. They are producing arts, music, films. They make food. They engage in forms of civil disobedience. Iranian writers are some of the most underestimated groups of authors and literary producers in the world. But still, we are not seeing signs of those stories in the media coverage in our newspaper pages. And then the resistance to the inclusion of different experiences and perspectives when it comes to commentary and conversation on Iran. We are not trying to discover those we haven't given the chance to express their thoughts and views just because we are at the mercy of again, a specific set of cliches. So these are our guests for whatever topic comes to mind that needs to be discussed. We reach out to them and we ask them to repeat the same ideas over and over. We are not making discoveries. And also the fact that sometimes I cannot rule out that I feel that there is a personal element of vendetta and just animosity in what I read about Iran. I do not want to exaggerate the extent of this sort of coverage. Much of what happens in Iran is debatable. Pretty much everything that the Iranian government does is up for debate because they are not making sane, reasonable decisions. Otherwise, the country wouldn't have been in this position. Otherwise, the country wouldn't have been in turmoil. We are talking about the theocracy that is inflexible, dogmatic, repressive, authoritarian, but this is not black and white. And then it brings me to the question of, is it only about the reality of democracy versus authoritarianism? If so, then why don't we see the same sort of coverage about so many other authoritarian states in the region with which the Western world actually maintains very friendly and cordial ties? If elections are the parameters of democracy, the number of elections in Iran's history on aggregate have been more than the number of elections in Israel. But that doesn't make Iran a democracy. And that doesn't mean that Israel is an autocracy in terms of what's being described and presented to the world, but that means that they are actually converging in a very similar direction. Both are abusing human rights on a massive scale. And finally, the point that I want to make about the media coverage of Iran is that whenever you tend to see any community of people in less equal terms and try to minimize their humanity, there is room for irresponsible action because that community as a whole has already been delegitimized. The dehumanization of Iranians started years ago when you had movies like The 300 or The Wrestler being produced with facing little objection in the artistic entertainment community in the US and constantly media commentary that framed this country as an entire evil incarnate object that needs to be treated with specific degree of cynicism. So when the US president currently in office has given himself the liberty of describing Iran as a nation of terror on multiple occasions, and when this doesn't spark reaction from those who say that they are standing for civil rights and they are against any form of exclusionary commentary, then you're creating the context and the circumstances leading to intensification of violence against that community. As a very concrete example, when the JCPOA, the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, was signed in 2015, all of a sudden Iran was on the list of the top 10 must-visit countries in every newspaper I was reading pretty much. Everyone was talking about how fascinating, magnificent, attractive that country is that all Westerners need to visit and travel to. That changed after Trump exited the JCPOA. All of a sudden, again, we are back to the narrative of Iran, the axis of evil.
Some experts are talking about the possibility of a regime change in Iran. In your opinion, how realistic is that scenario? And also, is there a political alternative to the Islamic Republic?
Iran is pretty much a very unpredictable context. No option is off the table when it comes to the future of Iran. Regime change is also a possibility, like many other authoritarian contexts in which repressive regimes have fallen and collapsed. So at the same time, we have to consider and understand the concept of regime change in terms of a concrete transition with concrete ramifications. It's not just a visualization. It's not just a fancy idea about Iran overnight turning into the Switzerland of the Middle East. We need to figure out what we mean when we talk about that outcome and how it will affect the livelihoods of 90 million people. We actually have a huge bureaucracy that is built on at least 4 million, some estimates 3 million government employees, hundreds of thousands of armed forces members, and actually huge ruling elites. If we are changing a regime, then are we going to exterminate all of these people who are actually part of the Iranian society? And whenever there's a conversation about regime change, which also pretty much happens to be reductionist, we are not taking into account that Iran, despite the secular progress that's been made and despite the liberalization that is happening, is still a country that is largely a Muslim country. huge population is identifying itself as the supporters of the current status quo. And there's a conversation about regime change, but does it mean that these people need to be subject to the same sort of punishments and restrictions that now the non-practicing, secular-minded Iranians are experiencing? Is it going to just reverse the roles of who is oppressing and who is being oppressed? Right now, as we speak, the narrative of retribution and retaliation is already underway. People who oppose war and sanctions are being threatened with trials and executions and violence. So if regime change in Iran means that we are going to purge, we are going to again embrace the narrative of violence and exclusion and retaliation, I'm not seeing any change actually happening. It's just the name of a system that is being altered, replaced with a different form of tyranny. But still, I guess every Iranian would welcome a democratic transition. Every Iranian would welcome a replacement of this inflexible, dogmatic, detached from reality clique of clerics who does not have a common language with the ordinary Iranians. All of that is alienating millions of Iranians who are just tired and pretty much sick with hearing the same old tropes, old slogans, old ideological posturing without seeing anything changing in their lives. Still, any regime change in Iran, if it's originating from overseas, there's no guarantee that when the current regime goes, the replacement would be sustainable.
You are an Iranian journalist based in the US, more specifically in New York City, covering Iran from afar. How does this physical distance shape the way you report on your country?
But that's a very good question because many of us who have been away happen to go through a change of perspective. And immigration per se changes perspective. And when you try to keep following and observing everything from afar, when you're not actually on the ground, you happen to be influenced by multiple factors. It's easy to give way to sometimes illusions, sometimes to be affected by your own biases. All of that have to be factored in. Sometimes we tend to find the most appealing way of framing our ideas. I can actually just start right now by saying the most fancy, most eloquent things about why this regime is murderous, it's repressive, and used a succession of adjectives that describe the Islamic Republic in the most derogatory ways, and everyone would be clapping for me because I've said the most brave things about the dictatorship. But does it mean that I'm doing journalism, or does it mean that I'm just giving a political speech for an audience to clap for me and applaud me? That's a different conversation. I have to try to be careful about the words that I choose. It's easy to give into the impulse and urge of coming across as fascinating, as well liked, as favorite in being a vociferous and outspoken opponent of whatever any specific entity or idea or geography or country represents. But I'm responsible not just to a certain demographic of readers or just to those who share a common ancestry with me. I have to be responsible before, first of all, to my conscience, and also before everyone who reads my stories, because I'm not just supposed to write for just a narrow set of readers and try to respond to their demands. Every demand coming from a reader who writes to me or who asks me questions is legitimate because people need accountability. But first of all, we have to realize that accountability doesn't mean that we have to absolve those who are in power and the politicians from their responsibilities and ask our questions from those who do not have decision-making power. Sometimes I find myself surrounded by actually commentary from especially the members of the Iranian diaspora who believe that I should be much more outspoken, less nuanced, less diplomatic, more fiery, incendiary in my writing. All I can say in response is that I'm a journalist, I'm not an activist. And
Mhm.
I'm not responsible for advocating for any outcome. I mean, if an outcome happens that I personally like as a citizen, I have a single vote. And if there is any free and fair election in Iran, I will cast my vote for someone that I happen to like if they're running for office. But I'm not in charge of advocating for or against things. That's not my job. Something else, when it comes to my reporting on the country from afar, I have to really maintain a certain degree of sanity when I write. Reading all of these horrible stories emerging not just from Iran but the entire region, and pretty much from the world in which we are living, which has turned into a universe of chaos and mayhem and instability. Actually, it other than science news announcing advancements in technology and discoveries that scientists and scholars are making, the rest of the news are about conflict, war, detentions, repression, punitive action, retaliation, going after our political opponents, tearing apart communities, cracking down on women and children, famine, destruction, and immigration being weaponized to smear entire nations and communities. This is the story of our world. And despite all of what's happening, if I'm focusing on Iran, I have to try to adhere to a set of clear strategies, including reading only the most verifiable, reliable, authentic sources, talking to people who enlighten me rather than mislead me, engaging in meaningful conversations with sources, first to understand their stories before recounting them myself, adhering to the principle of restraint, because everyone can be emotional, everyone can be excited, but if I'm actually giving into the impulse of excitement and agitation, again, I'm not doing my job.
Early in your career, you worked for major Iranian publications and interviewed Nobel Prize winners to connect Iran's academic world with the global one. How did this idea come together?
That originated from a conversation I had with the former editor-in-chief of the publication, who proposed that we did something that was novel and that could bridge the gaps in relations between Iran and the world through journalism and scholarship. And that publication, Danishmand, has been a major popular science daily that has been in print since 1960s. We decided that one way to approach that goal and objective was to talk to Nobel Prize laureates who hadn't ever interacted with Iran or who hadn't ever heard from Iranian journalists or who even hadn't pretty much heard about the country. And the outcome was a total of nearly 30 interviews with Nobel Prize laureates in these categories. Every conversation I approached with extensive preparation. This is how I understood about many of these concepts that these scientists and scholars had worked on. Hadn't ever majored in sciences or I hadn't actually done sciences, but I learned a lot about physics, astrophysics, and some aspects of chemistry and particles and nanochemistry. Some of the interviews happened through phone exchanges, which I described in my essay for New Lines magazine. Sometimes incurred staggering landline bills for my parents because I was living with them, and then they were pretty much civil in not criticizing me openly for doing that. Also, I had to at some point rely on assistance from my lecturers and former professors in my undergraduate school because universities were places where international calling equipment and phone calls were available, and you could make those calls at a much lower cost. So they provided me with access to their offices overnight, and to make up for the time difference between Iran and mostly the US East Coast and the Central Time Zone, I had to do the interviews pretty much after midnight. And many of the conversations happened over email, back and forth, exchange of questions and answers. It was an initiative that was really appreciated by the readers and also by the scientists and Nobel Prize laureates that we engaged and talked to. The Iranian readers would reach out with comments, emails, phone calls to express their astonishment, sometimes their happiness, sometimes their nostalgia, by saying that they were sorry that they didn't have access to these scientists, that none of them could travel to Iran because of the turbulent political situation between Iran and the other countries from which these laureates actually hailed, mostly the US, Britain, and other European countries. And many of the readers would say that they wanted to tread a similar path. One of them eventually ended up becoming a freelancer, contributing to Danishmand magazine. So that was an initiative that was appreciated at home. And also, Danishmand, we have to remember, it's been a very niche publication that appealed to only science lovers, the science geeks, aficionados. And then over time, the publication evolved into something much broader, incorporating commentary and reporting on new discoveries of different disciplines of sciences, either at home and abroad. And then internationally, the reaction from the scientists who responded to my questions and Nobel Prize laureates who engaged in those conversations were unanimously positive and productive. Many of them were, again, delighted, and they graciously gave me ample time for the conversations. They were delighted to hear from Iran that there is this huge passion and interest for sciences in Iran, a country that they didn't expect to be part of this conversation at all. Because again, the stereotypes mean that we do not expect there are people who might actually be doing this kind of thing. One laureate who I interviewed, Joseph Houghton Taylor, had been to Iran, and in the auditorium where he gave a talk at the Sharif University of Technology was filled with nearly 1,400 people. That auditorium is initially built for 400 spectators. That's the capacity of the auditorium. And he talked to me 2 years after he traveled to the country. And in the conversation, he told me that he was impressed by seeing this atmosphere of zeal and passion for sciences and interacting with Iranian students and faculty members. And pretty much all of these conversations involved an element of surprise being expressed by the Nobel Prize laureates who wanted to either travel to Iran or see the country in person, or had some form of vision for trying to understand it better.
Finally, how did these early experiences shape you as the journalist that you are today and the way you cover Iran?
I have been a journalist pretty much my whole adult life and pretty much my whole teenage life, and pretty much since the day I started to know myself and discover myself. I started writing in my father's weekly magazine when I was 8, and then I expanded my career beyond the borders of Iran after I enrolled in my undergraduate studies in 2008. And all of what I've accumulated as a package of experiences and observations, failures, disappointments, disillusionments, achievements, if there have been any, all of that has been through, I guess, trial and error, working, I guess, hard, commitment to understanding and learning, and commitment to correcting myself. One time, there was a professor at Northwestern University, Craig LeMay, who told me in an interview that part of being a journalist means that we have to admit we also make mistakes. And that statement still strikes a chord and still echoes in my mind, even though I haven't heard from him for years. But that's an interview I had translated into Persian. It was published in the 20th anniversary special edition of my father's weekly magazine. And I guess it's been a journey, and it's been something that I try to preserve as fastidiously and as diligently as I could. I didn't find myself beholden to interests or to agendas, and preserving your independence in this climate of competition, polarization, and conflicting interests is difficult. Whatever I wrote or whatever I reported on was something that I either believed in or something that I was convinced would be close to my truth and my heart. I, like everyone else, I mean, we are human beings. We are not set in a stone. We are not robots. We change our minds, we change our perspectives, we change our tone and language. But whatever I wrote and whatever I observed was something that I tried to discover first before telling others. No one ever dictated to me what to think and what to write. That's mostly my family, because they nurtured me and actually trained me with a culture of critical thinking, to question things before accepting them, question myself before presenting myself, and to understand that humility is an essential. Overall, we are living in a world in which the competition is about ideas and thoughts and convictions and the art of persuasion. And in this world, everyone is trying to convince the other side that they have the best ideas to sell, to market, to promote. Sometimes we end up panhandling actually these ideas instead of being honest about our way of presentation, and instead of just sharing thoughts and letting the audience decide. As journalists, we have been equipped with the ability to convince, or at least try to communicate a message, because we have the platform. If we build on that platform as genuinely, as ingenuously, and as honestly as we can, there's a chance our message would resonate with many who are listening to us. And still, persuasion and trying to convince others is part of the reality of the world, which is why many of the conversations we happen to hear today are not anymore about listening to the other side, which is an act of sacrifice because we are ignoring our own egos, our own hardcore beliefs, and we are trying to listen to something different that might actually contradict our own dogmas. And what I've been doing all along is to improve my own standards.
For listeners who want to better understand Iran, is there any book, movie, or documentary you would suggest?
I mean, there's a lot that can be read and watched and followed. I mean, the immediate thing that comes to my mind, I guess, after watching The Salesman by director Asghar Farhadi, which won an Oscar, you can probably watch The Seed of the Sacred Fig by Mohammad Rasulov, which is also competing for several international accolades. It's been sweeping so many awards that I've lost track. And also, it was just an accident by director Jafar Panahi, which was nominated in 5 different categories for the Golden Globes, but unfortunately didn't win any of the awards. Books, they said they wanted revolution by Nada Tului Semnani. Is documentaries, Our Man in Tehran by former New York Times correspondent in Tehran, whose name is blanking on me at this time, but I watched the documentary years ago, and that's something to watch. Again, on books, I can mention Iran Awakening by Shirin Ebadi, the former judge and lawyer in Tehran, who actually ended up becoming a Nobel Peace Prize laureate.
Thank you, Iranian journalist Kourosh Ziabari, for joining us today, and thank you for listening or watching. See you in the next episode with another guest to make the East a little bit nearer.